There it is. All right, shall we get started? Or
Absolutely.
all right. Welcome everyone. So today we're going to be hearing from Nick Juliano, who is actually, he was graduating the year that my first year here actually at SUNY Oneonta. He was actually really helpful for in helping to set up the planetarium and get that running during my first couple of months here especially. But then he also helped out with some great visuals of the asteroid belt, the solar system, and also a nice trip out to the edge of the universe too. We've actually upgraded our planetarium since then a couple of times, but we still have those visuals and we still use them from time to time. Right now, Nick is at both the College of Southern Nevada Planetarium, where he's actually the program director, is that right?
Program manager, yes.
Program manager, yep. And he's also studying astrophysics at UNLV as well. So looking forward to hearing the talk. And Nick, the floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you very much. Let me share my screen for a moment. I've got a whole presentation worked out. Can you confirm to me that you can see like a pink screen right now?
We can see pink screen, yes.
All right, and now can you see my slide?
Kinematics and dynamics.
Yes, okay, let me go back. All right, so thank you very much for the introduction, Josh. Hey everybody, my name is Nick Juliano. In smaller circles, I am known as the Star Lord of Las Vegas. And by smaller circles, I do mean myself and myself alone. So I'm the current program manager for the CSN Planetarium, and I am an astrophysics graduate student at UNLV. And like Josh said, I graduated from Oneonta with a BS in physics in 2015, and I've since had a slightly non-traditional professional and academic career. Just slightly. There have probably been people to have duplicated what I've done, but I did not expect the path I had. That's a little bit of what this is going to be about. So the topic of my presentation is going to be twofold. The first part is going to survey my path from Oneonta to my current position. I'll discuss how the first months following my graduation were far more difficult than I anticipated. I will go over how I transformed my rapidly declining career prospects into what I do today as the program manager. And I'll offer some candid advice in the form of what I wished I heard when I was an undergraduate. So this portion of my talk is dedicated and directed primarily towards the students in the audience specifically. And part two is going to detail my current research. So I currently work with Dr. Jason Steffen at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV, as well as I work with the California Planet Search and its well-known Keck Observatory in Hawaii to create a software pipeline that automates the detection and characterization of exoplanets. So those are planets orbiting other stars. I'm a firm proponent of the idea that more effort should be placed on automation of astronomical research with the purpose of enabling the pioneers within the field to focus their efforts on trailblazing. My research is conducted with this goal in mind. And part two, this portion of my talk is going to be presented with minimal math to keep the scope of everything approachable. Let me move on to the next slide. All right, so like I said a couple of times now, I'm the program manager at the College of Southern Nevada. It is a full-time job. They pay me to do it. I basically get paid to talk to people about space. It's the coolest thing in the world. I did not know that these types of jobs were actually things you could do for a living. But in addition to this, I'm also a full-time astrophysics graduate student, and that makes me 100% tired. I also hold a lot of other titles that don't make me any money or advance my career in any way. And my favorite of these, just a little bit of a plug, is I'm the trustee for the Hamilton Planetarium Scholarship, one of three. I was awarded this scholarship, a planetarium scholarship specifically for people trying to enter the planetarium field as a junior at Oneonta. and I'm the first recipient of the scholarship to have been named to its board. So I highly recommend that you look into this opportunity if you have any interest at all in entering the field. And if you do have interest in this and you want to have any questions, feel free to reach out to me after this presentation. I'm always at my email, so if you have any questions, I'll be happy to talk to you about them. Yeah, so I'll end my plug there. But a few other fun facts. My favorite of the ones on this list is that I served as an astronomical consultant for the astronaut Chris Hadfield. I don't know if you've ever seen his YouTube videos. He's really big on YouTube. He had one where he was in space playing David Bowie's song, and has since kind of skyrocketed, pun intended, his career to include a bit of humanitarian stuff. So he visited my planetarium just before the pandemic of like February 2020, and he conducted a couple interviews for Vanity Fair. In one of his interviews, he was doing a movie critiquing, space movie critiquing, and I believe it was Interstellar. He mixed up general and special relativity when he was talking about it, and I was like, "Excuse me, Mr. Hatfield, you mixed them up." And since then, he sought my advice throughout the rest of the interview. It was a pretty rewarding experience for me. But so for the visual learners, here's a bit of a timeline of my career. So I graduated in 2015, and from my junior year to shortly after I graduated, I spent some time as an intern and then kind of dipped my toes into the proper planetarium field as an educator at the Newark Museum. I then left that job to work at Guitar Center, of all places. And in a little bit, I'll kind of detail why that happened. But after that, I was lucky enough to get my current job in the summer of 2016. So nearly a little over a year after I graduated from Oneonta. And after that, I started my graduate studies at UNLV, and that started in the summer of 2019. So I spent a semester and a half in person, and I'm sure, like most of you now, most of my education has been virtual ever since. So this was my path from where many of you are now to where I am. I'm comfortably employed in astronomy. And this is a field where the overwhelming majority of jobs require a higher level degree, something like a master's or a PhD. But I have only ever earned a bachelor's degree to date. So what I want to talk about here is I want to discuss what I did at Oneonta that enabled me to hit the ground running and overcome that, I'm sure what you probably know, the employment paradox, I like to call it, where you need relevant experience to get a job, but you need a job to get relevant experience. I'll also discuss why my time at Guitar Center, which was well outside the field of astronomy, pushing guitar strings to 14-year-old prospective rock stars, was nearly necessary for me to re-enter the field. And then I'll talk about how I'm leveraging the position I'm in now to benefit not just my job, but all aspects of my life and my job. So at Oneonta, I was debating whether or not I wanted to actually include this in this presentation. I was a very overwhelmingly average student. My grades did not set me apart from anyone else in a at least in a positive way. And I knew I wasn't ready to go to graduate school following my time at Oneonta. So even though I wanted to use my degree in a relevant way, I had to make sure to bolster my resume as much as I could, because there are thousands of people graduating with degrees in physics, degrees in astronomy every year. And I think in the next 10 years, there's only projected to be like 1,000 additional jobs in the field, something like that. Don't quote me on that statistic. But what I did to set myself apart in my time at Oneonta is I volunteered with the planetarium, I volunteered with the observatory, and I invested a lot of my effort into, for example, my computational physics class. Dr. Gallagher actually taught that for me, which, by the way, Hugh, I'm actually a little bit upset that you taught the course in MATLAB and not Python. MATLAB is proprietary, and nearly nobody in the field that's conducting current research in astronomy is using MATLAB. It's mostly Python based because it's so well supported. But plug aside. But my computational physics class taught me the power of using computers within the hard sciences, kind of meshing the two to make everything happen. And then leveraging these experiences at Oneonta, I gained an internship at the Newark Museum the summer following my junior year. And the way I did this, a lot of people will tell you, apply to jobs, apply to jobs, apply to jobs, apply to internships, apply to internships, apply to internships. Decent advice, and it's worked out well for 90% of people, but what if you don't hear back from them? You need to make your own opportunities sometimes. And that's the position I was in. So I emailed the planetarium director at the Newark Museum just out of the blue. I didn't know him. I didn't have any connections. I just said, hey, I'm graduating, or I'm finishing my junior year off. I'm looking to get into the planetarium field. Do you have any work for me over the summer? I'm willing to do it for free. So they didn't actually have an opening listed, and they weren't looking for an intern, but that email prompted him to create the opportunity that wouldn't have otherwise existed. And this experience as an intern transitioned into my first job, because they created a part-time job for me after I graduated so that I could still work for them, because they valued my contributions that much. So sometimes it creates building the door before you can open it. And the worst thing that can happen is nothing changes. But unfortunately, following my time at the Newark Museum, at my time at the Newark Museum, I was actually net negative working there. The tolls for my commute were so high that I needed 2 additional part-time jobs just to support doing that. And it wasn't sustainable. I was 22 at the time, and I was driving for Uber. I was working as a landscaper, and I was doing a planetarium job just to maintain my experience. It didn't work. So I had to leave that job after a few months. I ended up leaving it, I think, October, November following my graduation. And that's how I got my job at Guitar Center. It was the only thing I could do to sustain myself at the time. And when I took inventory after starting working at Guitar Center, of my status of using my degree, I was in a really tough spot. I wasn't using my degree in any way. I was working in retail, a commission-based job, and my prospects to re-enter the astronomy field, like I said earlier, you need a master's most of the time just to get a job in the field. Each day it was getting slimmer, my chances of re-entering. So this left me with very few options, which in my opinion was one of the best things to happen, because since my options were limited locally, I considered any opportunity that would have me. And that motivated me to apply for my current job, fly across the country, and work at CSN, the College of Southern Nevada. I moved, took a road trip across the country, rented a house sight unseen, and started my job. But about 2 or 3 years into my tenure here, I decided to use one of the benefits afforded to me by my position and pursue graduate school. They offered financial assistance to pursue graduate school so that my out-of-pocket costs are nominal. And this is an excellent position for me. I am able to bring value to my employer and also gain value for myself. It's a great symbiosis. So where my job provides financial support for my education provides me with relevant skills for me to bring back to my job. Now everybody wins, and I'm at the center of it all, reaping every benefit possible. And I'm not making a graduate student salary, which has enabled me to buy this house that I'm in right now. So it's sometimes that unconventionalness is a good way to go forward. So to close out this portion of the presentation, here's just a list of some of the lessons I've learned within this time frame. It's possible that if you followed this exact path, you would have very different takeaways, but just giving me some perspective from my end. If you know that graduate school is your next path forward, that is excellent. That's great. You have some solid information, something solid to go off of. But if not, that's okay. It's not necessarily a now or never type thing. And sometimes delaying that decision can lead to really highly rewarding things or allow you to pursue opportunities you never expected to. Another takeaway is that it's always important to do what you want, or as some adjunct or emeritus geology professor at Oneonta told me, he framed it as following your bliss. So make sure to do that, but also make sure that you're doing everything possible to better your future. And one additional thing to keep in mind is that your grades are not some sort of caste system that determines your status in life. Academia is important. It's very important. I have a job and a schooling within academia right now. Everything I have comes from academia, but it's just a portion of everything that exists. And grades are just one single way of measuring your contributions. It is still important to put your best foot forward, but make sure to invest in your opportunities for experience as well. As students in college, you have so many opportunities available to you, and so many more you can create because of the support that you're provided within Oneonta. It's important not to be buried in your coursework at the expense of more real world oriented experiences. Yeah. So this is basically my concludes the first part of my presentation. In the interest of time, I'm going to take questions for both the kind of career-oriented aspect of things and my research at the end. So I'll move on now to part 2, which is my research, which is automating the detection and characterization of exoplanets. So this is a modified version of the presentation I did for the Las Vegas Astronomical Society. So the level in which I'm assuming of general knowledge for this portion is somewhere in between the amateur astronomer and the graduate student, which I think is actually firmly in the realm of undergraduate. So it's pretty ideal. So the main question that motivated me to pursue my current research project was, it was a question I asked my astronomy professor at Oneonta. This was before Dr. Nolenberg was in place. And I wasn't satisfied with this answer to this question, which was, if we know how to detect exoplanets to a very high precision, why do we have to do it ourselves? Why can't we just make the computers do it? But I wasn't satisfied with his answer. I don't remember what it was at the time, but it was basically something like, oh, pixels and error and stuff. But why do we have to sift through the data to make these discoveries? And what I've wound up finding out, at least in some ways, is that we don't. In order to explain why, I'll need to provide a bit of general background. So roughly speaking, there are 2 main types of research in astronomy, or most sciences for that matter. The first one is theoretical. And this applies mostly to topics that are not fully understood, need a bit more development before experimentation, can verify results. For example, there are things like dark energy, dark matter, black hole accretion disks, the things that black holes suck up, the behavior of those mechanisms. But then the second one is experimental astronomy, which on the other hand deals with topics that are very well understood in astronomy. So measurements are taken with telescopes to verify complete, or at least nearly complete, mathematical and theoretical models. Subject matters in this approach include stellar structure, orbital mechanics, and exoplanet identification, which is the subject matter of my research. And in experimental astronomy, consistent, verifiable, and well-documented results are the best types of results. But how do we get these consistent results that we're looking for? And the answer to that is data. What we do is we take numerous measurements of the sky to generate large amounts of data with the objective of obtaining consistent results that verify our theories. And more is better. And this has led to the invention of the modern age survey telescopes, which are built to be used very generally. And that means that they don't purposefully take observations of specific celestial targets, but instead they sweep areas of the sky at scheduled intervals. An example of this is the Vera Rubin Observatory. When I was in Oneonta, we called it the LSST, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. This is a behemoth of a project. The CCD, the camera that's taking the measurements, is 3.2 gigapixels. For perspective, a good digital camera is like 50 megapixels. So we're talking orders of magnitude higher. But with this huge camera, it's taking a 15-second exposure of the sky every single 20 seconds that it can. And that's making it able to photograph the entire available sky every few nights. This requires a lot of data. In addition, there have been projects like the Kepler Space Telescope, which ran from 2009 to 2018. And that only surveyed 115 square degrees of the sky. And even with that, its data is still being analyzed. We're still generating insights from the Kepler missions. And Kepler's successor, TESS, started at 2018. It's an all-sky survey. So instead of the 115 square degrees of the sky, it's looking at an area 400 times larger. And it's expected to be able to detect over 14,000 transiting planets from this mission alone. So like I said, this is generating petabytes of data. These are terabytes of terabytes on top of terabytes. It's a lot of data. The Rubin Observatory is 100, it requires 100 petabytes just to hold the data, just to hold these images. And that was a recent upgrade from what it used to expect when the mission started, of how much storage it would require. So this is just growing and growing and growing. Right, so that makes traditional astronomy difficult to work with in these situations. We have an overwhelming mass of data, essentially. And traditional astronomy follows the scientific method. You've got an idea, you make an observation based on that idea, you analyze the results of that observation, you draw conclusions from your analysis, and then you report those results. You could, in essence, do that for every single individual file generated by these telescopes, but that's a lot of time. So that's where the idea of a pipeline comes in. And what a pipeline does is it bypasses steps 3 and 4 of this method. So the experiment in our case is the telescope making an observations. And once that observation is made, it's sent into this pipeline that sends this information to a computer, and the computer automatically performs a series of steps that does parts 3 and 4, analyzes the results, draw the conclusions, and then it sends it to some sort of reporting system. So like I said, my research deals with pipeline development for exoplanets. So what analysis does an exoplanet detection pipeline do? How does it bypass steps 3 and 4 to automate the reporting and finding of results? What my pipeline is doing is taking 2 well understood, fully documented, fleshed out ways of detecting exoplanets, combines those 2 methods, and automates the analysis to do what humans would typically do, therefore enabling human knowledge to keep up with the petabytes of data that are being generated. So the first of these methods that my pipeline uses is the Doppler, or the radial velocity method. So when a star has an orbiting body to it, that body is exerting a gravitational force on its host star. And that gravitational force, as the body orbits, causes the star to oscillate, just slightly oscillate within its orbit. Now, the top animation here shows this, this idea from the top down, and the bottom one shows it edge on. When they're more edge on than top down, that's a bit more useful for us, because we then observe the spectrum of light emitted by these host star. And we see this motion in the form of red and blue shift. So just like an ambulance siren sounds different when it's coming towards us versus when it's moving away from us, starlight has a signature of motion as well. And this signature helps us to determine the radial velocity of that star, or in other words, the relative motion toward and away from us traveled by that star. And we can then use that information to deduce characteristics of orbiting bodies. But unfortunately, this is not cheap to do accurately. My radial velocity data, for example, comes from the Keck Observatory by way of the California Planet Search. So the telescope in itself, the Keck telescopes, they cost money on their own, but the instrument that uses these telescopes to perform the spectroscopy required to get that spectrum that we saw on the previous slide, that instrument alone, the high-res spectrometer, is $4 million. And this isn't even the most accurate radial velocity detection instrument. It's accurate to about 3 meters per second, whereas the best one we have in the world is about accurate to about 1 meter per second. Yeah, so and unfortunately, most of the places that generate this kind of data are proprietary. So the high-res spectrometer is, its data is proprietary, meaning that it is owned by the people who own the instrument and the telescope. And in order to access it, you need to either be on their team or pay them. Luckily, I'm on their team. The second method of detecting exoplanets, you might have heard of this one as well, is the transiting method. So just like if I was just trying to flashlight in your face and then block it out with my hand, there's obviously less light reaching you when my hand is in front of it than when my hand is not in front of it. The same thing happens when an orbiting planet comes in between us and the host star. And that blocks out some of the light, a small portion of the light, and it happens at periodic intervals throughout the planet's orbit. And this helps us figure out how big a planet is, how far away it is, a lot of different things, a little bit about its orientation as well. And this is a very well understood method. Now, the one thing that makes my research a little bit different from a standard transit method is the idea of the transit timing velocity, or transit timing variation, pardon me. And this was pioneered by my advisor, Dr. Jason Steffen, and his advisor when he was a PhD student. What he does is he looks for variations in the signature of a transiting body. And it's tough to explain without a visual representation. So luckily enough, I found a really great one that does this job well. So with a single body orbiting a star, its orbit happens very regularly. As it transits the star, we can record the time it takes for it to be exactly in the middle of its host star. And this happens at very regularly defined intervals. At every 60 seconds, it reaches the same spot. 60 seconds, it reaches the same spot, so on and so forth. We're mostly talking days, but here we go. But if we introduce a second body to this system, a second planet to this system, that second planet exerts a gravitational force on the first one. So even if we don't see that second planet orbiting or transiting the star, if it's too far away or anything like that, it still exerts a gravitational influence on the orbiting planet that transits. And that causes that first orbit to vary within a set of orbits. And what we're left with is not regularly defined intervals, but one time the planet might transit a little faster, one time it might transit a little bit slower. And even though it's not a regularly defined interval, it is still something that we can explain because we can justify it by assuming an additional body at a certain location exerting that gravitational force. So what we're left with here is two different sets of data. We have a time series of the host star's velocity from the radial velocity measurements. And with this transiting method, we wind up with a list of the transit midpoint times. Whether or not that's varying with time or that's at regularly defined intervals doesn't entirely matter for the scope of this project. But luckily for many target stars, there exists both of these measurements in pretty large quantities. So we have both radial velocity types of observations of the star, and we also have known transits and transit timing variations of this exact same star. But the question then becomes, how do we use these measurements? Great, we have these measurements. None of these are direct observations of a planet. These are all indirect things. How do we use these measurements to generate information about orbiting objects, about exoplanets? And the one way that is being used more often than not right now is a method called MCMC, which is Markov chain Monte Carlo. This is a type of statistical analysis first invented by the genius math gods, but astronomers have very recently hijacked this method for pretty much every subfield of astronomy. And the best way to summarize MCMC is it's a method of high-speed guess and check. It's a series of steps where you guess and see how close that is to what's actually going on. So to detail the process a little bit more, or at least flesh it out, the first step is that you make a random guess. In my case, for this exoplanet identification project, you make a random guess about how many planets there are orbiting a star. And then you also guess their characteristics. This one is 2 times the size of Earth, orbiting about a period of 13 days. This other one is 10 times the size of Earth, orbiting at a period of about 20 days. So that's step 1. The next step is to simulate the radial velocity and transit time variations. Should those two bodies be the ones orbiting that star? And that's why these methods need to be very well understood. They need to be so well understood that we can simulate what we would observe if this happened or if that happened. We need to be able to understand the mathematical processes behind these at such a high precision that these simulations have some actual concrete structure and substance behind them. So then what we do is we compare those simulations to reality. Okay, so if we had this guessed system, how would that, what kind of results, what kind of measurements would we detect from here on Earth? Are they close? And then step 4 is we guess again. We make another guess. There's only one planet this time, and it's 10 days of an orbit, and it's 20 times the size of Earth. And we make simulations based on that. And then we compare our 2 guesses. Okay, so guess 1 was this accurate. Guess 2 was this accurate. Guess 1 was a little bit more accurate. So what we do then is we throw out guess 2, we keep guess 1, and then we rinse, we repeat until our guesses are so close to reality that they basically match. But in order to do this, you often need over 1 million guesses. My code's running right now on the Cherry Creek supercluster, and it's at 6 million right now for Kepler 36. And these computers can do this much faster than us. That's why computational physics, using computers to do science, is so important. I could make these guesses myself and I could go through this process, but what good does it do when it's going to take me my entire lifetime and maybe get to a single point? Computers can do this 100 times a second. They can compare hundreds of models to each other in a second. That fast. So it's important to be able to use computers to do this stuff. And that's essentially what my pipeline does. It bypasses the analyzing results and drawing conclusions by doing it, by having computers do it instead of people do it. So this exoplanet detection pipeline, just as a bit of a summary, what it does is it combines the data from, in my case, the Keck telescopes in Hawaii and the Kepler Space Telescope. And then it simulates planetary systems using both radial velocity and transit techniques. And then it compares the simulations that it makes to the data that we got from Keck and from Kepler. And then it identifies what's called a best fit, which is essentially this model is the best fit for our observations. What this does is it's automated, it saves time, it mitigates human error, it does it. It just does it. You make sure that the pipeline works, the code is valid, it does the science scientifically, and it doesn't make mistakes. So just to show a little bit of results, like I said, I've been analyzing right now the Kepler 36 system. And that's a very well understood planetary system. It's the 36th known planetary system discovered by the Kepler Space Telescope. We know that there's at least 2 bodies orbiting it. And that's what the figure on the left represents. The figure on the left is a best fit plot of 2 individual planets orbiting a host star. And what these plots are called corner plots. I'll try to explain them as best as I can. They're basically probability distributions of all of the parameters within a system. So think of like a bell curve for like a grading curve, anything like that. It's a probability distribution of all of the orbital parameters for separate planets. In the case of the figure on the left, that I assumed that there were 2 planets within this system. And those planets both had a mass. They each had a period. They both had things like a mean anomaly, an eccentricity, an inclination. And they explored the parameter spaces for all of those types of orbital parameters, orbital elements, and wound up at this distribution of gases being the best fit for the system. And the figure on the right is the same thing, but taking a 3rd planet into consideration. And so for this Kepler 36 system, comparing the radial velocity measurements for a 2-planet fit versus a 3-planet fit. So if we assume it's only 2 planets, the blue dots on the plot represent what we've observed from the Keck telescopes. And the red dots represent what my simulations wound up arriving at. So assuming 2 planets, you can see that they're not quite where they should be. They don't quite line up, the model doesn't quite line up with simulations. But once we introduce that 3rd planet, there's a bit more agreement between the simulations of the system and our known observations.
Nick?
So yeah, I went through that a little bit faster than I anticipated, but I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
I wonder what the horizontal axis is on that last plot there.
Time. I think it's barycentric Julian date is what the BJD means. It's basically days, it's measured in days from a specific point in time.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a time series essentially. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I'm happy to yield for questions if there are any.
Any questions? Nick, could you show the covariance plots or the corner plots again for the cosmology students? This is actually all the rage in cosmology as well, especially, and we'll be showing you some of these when we start talking about different models of cosmology in the next couple of weeks. Yeah, those are great. Question over there?
So going on back to the plot. So you said 3 planets made it seem more fitting. Does that mean that you're going to run another one on the 4th planet, 5th planet, 6th planet, and see at which point they get that best fit line? Or not best fit line.
That's a good question. The answer to your question is I did that, and these are the prettiest looking results. There are ways of statistically determining which model is the best. And it's important to take into account the complexity of your model. So how many parameters you're introducing to this Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation, because the complexity of the simulation is less justifiable the more complex it gets. So by introducing a 4th planet to the system, I was able to get the fit to look much better than the one on the right on this slide. But I evaluated something called the Bayesian information criterion, which takes into account how good the fit is versus how complex the fit is. And the 3-planet model was the most justifiable for this system. And you can obviously see they don't line up. So this isn't the full picture of what's going on there. But statistically speaking, this is the most justifiable explanation for what's going on within this planetary system.
Thank you.
Another question?
It was a question on the computers processing the data. You said that they can make about 100 guesses per second. Is that only limited to the amount of data they can take in, or is there other things to account for in making the guesses that make it so it can't be faster?
That's a good question. You can see here, like I said, I'm doing both radial velocity and transit methods, which means I have radial velocity data and transit data to compare my simulations to. You can see on these plots here that there's maybe 30 blue dots, and those 30 blue dots represent points of data that we've made these measurements that we're comparing to. So the general idea would be that if the amount of data you can ingest is the only thing that determines the complexity of the code, basically the time dependency of the code, that something with 30 points wouldn't be that computationally intensive. But what winds up happening is there are other factors at play as regard to the speed of a code. Most importantly are 2 separate ones. Number one is how many orbital parameters I am assuming there are. So essentially how many planets I'm putting into the system. The more demanding, computationally demanding the model will be. The second thing to consider is how long of a time series I'm sampling through. So you can see on either of these plots, we go from about 2.456 times 10 to the 6th days to 2.459 times 10 to the 6th. So a few years worth of simulation. So I'm trying to use numerical methods, basically stepwise discrete methods instead of continuous ones, to generate a time series. And that involves incrementally doing the physics behind this for each passing day. So the longer that time span, the more demanding each individual guess and check step would take in order for it to actually be able to compare observations to results.
Is that an n-bodies simulation that you're using?
I'm using the TTV fast code within Python. That's the main kind of structure behind mine, but I also wrote my own general MCMC package around this whole thing. I don't know if you have GitHub, but it's on GitHub.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I have a question for Starlord. How does it make you feel that your fits are always showing much slower radial velocities than the actual data? Like, wouldn't you think that some would be faster and some would be slower instead of every single one of them is slower almost? Isn't that weird?
It's not that every single one is faster or slower. If you look throughout the time series,
Right, yeah, not everyone, but the average. And the maximum radial velocities of the red dots are very much smaller than the maximum radial velocities of the blue dots.
Right. Yeah. I mean, specifically speaking to the first 2 points, that's very apparent. I understand the point you're making. You're making it successfully, but I'm not concerned with that because I don't have a very completely sampled time series here. So in other words, I don't have, throughout the course of the couple of years that these data samples were taken, a very exhaustive list of measurements. I didn't take a measurement every single day and have a fit I can compare it to. This is thinly sampled. This is not much information to go off of. Because of that, I'm not able, for the justification of my third body, or my fourth body, my third planet, to justify anything more than fitting the mass, the period, and I believe it's the mean anomaly, the starting point within its orbit. I can't think about the eccentricity of the planet. I can't think about the inclination of it. I can't think about the longitude of the ascending node, which would correspond with the inclination, because there are so few data points. And for perspective as to why there are so few data points, each one of those blue dots takes about an hour of keck time, and an hour of keck time is about $10,000.
Expensive, yeah.
You'll see that all of the points on the right side, that kind of right portion of each of these plots, those were taken after I started doing the project and starting to show to the people who determine what's done with keck time, hey, there's something going on here. And they said, okay, you need more measurements to be able to justify this. We're going to take more. So those last 5 or 6 were justified by the early stages of my research. That's $50,000 to $60,000. I didn't spend that money. Someone else was just like, this is worth it because it's that justifiable. So while I'm still a graduate student and I don't yet have the kind of appeal to authority that most professors would have in this kind of environment, I think the fact that my research influenced this kind of observation, at the very least, would be the qualitative thing to put my thoughts about those red dots always being a little bit smaller or slower in terms of its absolute velocity than I would think. So yeah, that kind of put me at ease there.
Thank you.
Did you have a question?
Valerie can go.
Oh, okay.
So have you used your code at all to try and better constrain like the mass and the radius of known planets, or have you only used it to try and see if there's additional planets in the system?
I compared my fit. So far, I've compared my fit just in the Kepler-36 system, and my code agrees with what is currently known about the system. So I tried it with the 2-planet model, which is the current assumption of the system, is that there's a planet orbiting at about 13.835 days and one at like 16.3. And in my corner plots here, my covariance plots, that's exactly what the results said. So I know that the kind of black box of code that I'm working with, or everybody's working with, is in agreement with reality, or at least accepted reality in science. We're always trying to learn more. So then I know that if I'm searching for a third planet and I can statistically justify it using those kind of frameworks I spoke of earlier, then that's leading theory at this point.
So Nick, when I look between 2.4570 and 2.4575, it looks like you have 5 measurements in there. So how long were those over? It actually looks like you're capturing almost half a cycle of the star's motion.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what's that?
Go ahead. I was about to speak to something that wasn't happening.
And so my question is, how big a timeline do you need to actually, you know, I'm sure we get bigger with 2, 3 planets and 4 planets, but how big a baseline do you need in time so that you could actually get the best fit? It seems like if you kept going and let it go through a few cycles, you might actually have the data. And so then the question would be, how much money do you have to ask for?
The answer is almost always too much. But it's not necessarily about the length of time in which you take observations over. Yes, that does come into play because you do want to get at least through 1 or 2 cycles of at least the dominating orbiting body, the most gravitationally influencing body that's causing these radial velocity measurements. But the more important thing is to have an exhaustive set of measurements. I could have 400 measurements, but if those measurements are taken once every 5 years, that's not going to tell me much. It would go over thousands of years at that point, or some high number of points at that point, but it wouldn't tell me much about what the star is doing in between that time. So you want to have an exhaustive set in terms of shorter amount of time. So it's more so about your sampling rate. And in this case, this was the best that we can get. And this is actually the best in the world at this point.
I have another question if no one else is going to ask. You guys are quiet over there. It's raining here, Nick, so people are quiet.
I haven't seen rain in months.
We get a lot of rain. I'm wondering, why did you pick Kepler 36?
I didn't. Before I was a graduate student, I went to my advisor saying, hey, why don't we do this? I asked him the question that I was unsatisfied with, the why don't we just make computers do the math question? And he was like, I have friends with data that can help you answer this question. And this was the most exhaustive list that they have. So what I'm hoping my publication about this will do is motivate more people to interpolate radial velocity in transit observations or take more exhaustive radial velocity sampling in order to continue this pipeline.
Great.
I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I had a follow-up too, but Nate's going to go first.
Well, so you said that you're making this pipeline so that you can leave for people to start pioneering in different fields in astronomy, being as the quote unquote busy work would be left to the machines. What would this new pioneering be?
That's for the pioneers to figure out. I consider myself an astronomical custodian. I'm, like I said, I was an average student, and that carried over from my undergraduate to my graduate studies. I don't consider myself to be the smartest person in the room in most rooms I'm in, but I'm not satisfied by having to have people do the things that we already know how to do. I have a smart house. My thermostat changes its temperature because I don't want to change the temperature of my thermostat. We know how to do these things. We shouldn't have to do them over and over and over. I have great respect for who I call the pioneers within the field that are still alive, still doing research, still trailblazing. And I don't want them to have to think about this boring stuff here, because we already know how to do this. I'm just trying to make sure that the computers can do it so that everyone else can think about other stuff. I don't intend to continue researching after this. This is the one thing that I wasn't satisfied with, and I'm trying to solve. I don't have an overarching call to research. I don't have an overarching call to continue to grow the field. I have an overarching respect for the field. And this is the type of contribution I wanted to make.
Did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm wondering is your code at some point in time, if it got to where you wanted, it could go through the surveys and just go from star to star and do the analysis. How do we detect exoplanets around systems in which we're looking at them top down?
Most of the time we don't. Most of the time, the only way we can really draw conclusions is by looking for the signals that the exoplanet passes on to its host star, because the host star is the thing that we can see. If the information is lost in its orientation, we're not going to be able to make any conclusions about it. So it does need to be oriented perfectly, or at least nearly perfectly, for us to make any sort of to draw any sort of insight from the data we're getting. We could have a star that's at an inclination of 90, or essentially we're not looking at an edge on. The edge is perpendicular to us, and that's going to tell us absolutely nothing about its radial velocity. We'll see a bunch of zeros when we take measurements of it. So there could be the biggest planet in the world orbiting it, and we don't know it because we just don't have the signal. So other ways in which we do detect exoplanets would be, there's two others. One of them is direct imaging. So we block out the starlight and we see if it reflected its light on another body nearby, and that light is reflected in our direction. We see that, we don't see the star, we know that's a planet. That has to be very perfect in order for us to actually detect a planet that way, because it needs to be a large enough planet, it needs to reflect enough light, it needs to be at the perfect orientation as well, so we're limited in terms of orientation. And the second method is one that I'm upset has already been discovered, because if not, I would have discovered it. It's gravitational microlensing. I asked my advisor about gravitational microlensing, and he was like, yeah, this is already a thing. I was like, but what it is the same idea behind gravitational lensing. So where a highly massive object like a galaxy or a black hole, the light from behind it in some orientation behind it is curved by the gravity of the highly dense object, and we can see the signals of that curve from here on Earth. That also exists on smaller scales. We during solar eclipses, we use gravitational microlensing or gravitational lensing of some kind to justify general relativity by looking at the background stars and how that light is slightly shifted by the sun. That also applies to orbiting bodies in space, orbiting stars. So as a planet transits, or even if it doesn't transit, it's close enough, it still bends the starlight, dipping that starlight away from us because it curves it away from our line of sight. But again, we're limited in terms of its orientation to us. So there's no real way to have a complete survey because we just lose the signals.
Nick, to what degree do stellar pulsations actually impinge themselves in the error budget here?
That is it's funny that you asked that, because looking at these blue dots here, the Keck data radial velocity measurements, like I said, my research was the justification for that last set of measurements on the right side. With more observations from a spectrometer, specifically for radial velocity, that helps you kind of mitigate that noise. So further observations help you change that. So the data set I was looking at prior to this new set of data that I have wasn't, so for the example, the first point looks like it's at about 12.5 meters per second in the positive axis, and the next one's at -15, give or take. They weren't there because the type of corrections done for stellar pulsation, or just a general averaging over time, were completely different because the new set of measurements informed the previous set and adjusted them. So we are also here at the paradox of, or not the paradox, the difficulty of a more exhaustive set being the most useful thing we could have, yet the most expensive thing we can have. At some point, you need to say, we spent enough money, here's what we know.
Also, I had another question too, and so you're using a Bayesian information measure to sort of determine the number of planets that you're trying to fit. So that's actually motivated by the number of degrees of freedom in your data set, as opposed to the fact that we do see solar systems with multiple objects. Because so you would expect that you would see other solar systems with lots of objects, but in order to classify your data, you're not necessarily going to be sensitive to all the objects in the system. And given the number of data points you have a limit to the number of actual orbital elements that you can model. Is that right?
You said it better than I could. Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah, all of that is right. If we had a more exhaustive set, then we'd be able to not have to consider how detailed our system would be. But it's the same type of problem that would exist if we were at Kepler-36 trying to take these measurements of the sun. We wouldn't be able to detect Pluto with our current detection techniques, even if we had the most exhaustive set, because we don't have radial velocity instruments sensitive enough to detect the wobble of the sun caused by Pluto, let alone the multiple orbiting bodies of Pluto. So
Right.
there's a sensitivity limit caused by that. Yeah, absolutely, you're right.
Great. So, are there any other questions?
Is there one in the chat box? Did I see that pop?
Oh, there was someone who said something in the chat box, and actually they said, I have to go, but wonderful presentation and lecture, and have a good day, everyone. That's from Luke Mock.
Just gotta
Yeah.
make sure you got it.
Yeah.
Well, what was the question?
Oh, it was a comment. Great talk, and thanks. And he was also wishing everyone a wonderful day. So, yep.
I hope he has a great day as well.
We should have
Stop
done it.
sharing.
Awesome. Great. Any other questions?
I love your Oneonta State swag there in the background. Nice.
Oh, yeah, I actually just put that up for this. It's not normally there.
That's awesome.
And were you, well, so I guess another question I might ask is, would you get better results if you were using MATLAB?
Absolutely not. No, maybe. I mean, no, it would probably be identical if I replicated the code identically, we'd see identical results. That's the whole idea behind it. But it would take longer.
Your project, if I'm remembering correctly, was taking music and doing Fourier decomposition of music. And I think it was, I don't think it was your band's music, or was it?
It was my band's music, but it was basically any input file you could do. Yeah, so the whole idea behind my code was to use fast Fourier transform on a wave file to deconstruct it into its from a time series to a frequency, from time space to frequency space. And then I was able to save the songs as text files. And then I wrote another portion of the code that took those text files and then made a wave file from that. So took numbers, a list of numbers, and made a song out of it. I took that another step farther by just adjusting some of the coefficients when doing the transform and seeing how that influenced the song. And that didn't go very well. But yeah, no, that was exactly what I did.
And you were also part of a band that won a Battle of the Band competitions in your junior year?
The glory days. I think that was my junior year. Yeah, I was a keyboardist in was it like a heavy metal type band? Somewhere up there.
What was the band name?
Somewhere up there. We had an album come out in 2015, but I wouldn't advise the professors in the room to find that music. I'm not in that band anymore.
Are you telling us it's gonna be like reading our spies?
We're too old.
Oh, too old, okay.
I'm going to stay quiet.
The search seems to be ongoing.
So you may not know, but or maybe do, Dr. Rapson is our second astronomer now. And she's young. So she's already listening to it.
Check it out.
There's just a couple songs with some really profane lyrics. I would not recommend.
Oh, that's easy.
Was
I
that
thought
part
the
of?
profanity was directed at us.
No. I cheated on my test.
Didn't you perform in OFES at one point?
Yeah, I mean, we performed at, there was not OFES specifically, but the street thing.
That's what
We did some tours around the Northeast area too. There was one time we played a show for Hell's Angels. That was very scary. But yeah, no, that was a different thing. And I actually did leverage that experience. In the planetarium, I'm working with audio all the time. We make commercials for local institutions like we just did one like a year ago for Sloan Canyon, which is a national recreation area around us. And I utilized my audio production type skills that I acquired from that band and my time in Oneonta to do that. I wouldn't have been able to do that without that experience.
Oh, along those lines, we're working with the music department, especially Andres Ballins there. He occasionally has classes actually make music for us and sonifications of data. So we can share some of those with you if you'd like.
I'd love that. Thank you.
And actually, your talk was wonderful, Nick, and it's so great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Likewise.
So inclusion of the next talk would be skills you learn in extracurriculars turn out to support your career endeavors.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do recommend that anybody who's interested in the planetarium field or just an astronomy career in general, not quite comfortable coming to your professors or anything like that, but feel free to come to me. My email should be readily available. If not, feel free to share it. Especially if you're interested in the planetarium field, because I have a lot of money in my scholarship and nobody applies for it. Please apply. Like, talk to me. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. I'll be happy to give you some insight and direction on that.
We did, when you sent it to me, we did distribute it. So
So it's on the students.
we'll keep doing that.
Okay.
Because that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Appreciate it.
The song wasn't that bad, by the way. I listened to about half of it.
Dr. Rapson.
Okay. Thank you.
Again, young.
Great. Well, it's great
All
to see
right.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much.
That was a great talk.
Enjoy the cold.
Nice.
Take care.
All right.
Thank you, Stephen.
And
Stephen, you there?
yep, see, nice meeting, or nice seeing you all.
Okay.
Thank you for the presentation. It was great. And
Let him know there's another one next week.
Stephen, yep, there's another one next week.
3 weeks in a row.
You'll be there. Awesome.
This is the first week,
Okay.
and then next week and the week after.
I just
Are those new from the beginning of